And yet all the surrounding nations don't have nearly as many, including nations that have very strong trade agreements with China. The United States imports more from China than I think any other country, and yet we're not seeing 10,000 cases. I mean, not yet. We definitely could because the virus spreads, but for Iran to get it so quickly and so intensely, this is why people are raising an eyebrow to it. And it is suspect. Now, look, when you think of Italy, which we're going to get to Italy on this because the Russian officials, they've pointed a finger saying that Italy is also a target of this type of terrorism, and we'll get to why that might be. But you know, when you first look at the pandemic that's going on and you see China with 80,000, okay, that makes sense because that's ground zero, right? But and Italy makes a lot of sense too. I was living in Italy last year, and I can tell you there are loads and loads, millions and millions of Chinese tourists in Italy. Italy is the #1 tourist destination in the world. There are millions of Chinese tourists in Italy. So it makes a lot of sense that Italy would be a very hard-hit country, considering it's like one giant amusement park in Italy. I mean, the tourism in Italy is massive. So that to me made sense. But then the question of Iran with 10,000 cases, that doesn't make as much sense. Iran is not a big tourist destination. You know, how many Chinese are showing up in Iran for tourism? That doesn't make as much sense. So it is a bit eyebrow raising. It's a bit eyebrow raising. Now, what do the Russians have to say? So some Russian officials blame the United States. They say this was a biological weapon unleashed by the United States. Igor Nikolin, he was an official who used to be on the Russian Biological Weapons Committee. He claimed that the coronavirus is an American biological weapon that is used to defeat its enemies, including China and Iran. He said, listen, animals in China have been sold and consumed and eaten for thousands of years, but the coronavirus has not been transmitted to humans all of those years, but in the last 20. So he's saying, you know, they've been eating these animals forever. And so why suddenly are all these viruses cropping out of China from eating animals? Now, I think a really logical explanation to that would be that we now pump animals with loads of hormones and all kinds of things in order to mass produce animals. So sure, there is. To me, it makes logical sense that we would see a lot more viruses and issues coming from animals because what we feed the animals is genetically modified, and we're genetically modifying the animals. So, you know, it's kind of bound to get back at you. But he's saying, you know, his theory is, listen, something else is going on. He says that this is the 4th most prevalent virus in China. He says, I think it's not a coincidence, but it is a design. He says, quote, because the Americans appear... Now this, I had to translate these quotes from... they originally were in Russian and then they were in Persian. And I actually translated these from Persian. So they're not exact, but they're pretty close. He says, quote, because the Americans appear to be bound by a series of agreements, they have moved labs outside of the United States to prevent catastrophes in their country. He said of the reason for such labs around China. So he was saying that there's all of these labs that the United States has set up all around China in various regions, including in South Korea, in Taiwan, in Pakistan, all around the world. The United States has set up these medical labs. And he's saying that the United States doesn't want them on American soil, so we've been putting them in other countries. He says, we know that something happened, such as the outbreak of anthrax virus in the U.S. Army's Institute of Infectious Diseases in Washington, D.C. in 2008. The Americans also refused to sign the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and said we would not implement it because we have trade secrets and do not want to tell anyone what we're doing. Beyond that, thousands of Chinese tourists and businessmen come to Russia, but there are no viruses. So he's saying, look, no virus in Russia. We got thousands of Chinese tourists, thousands of Chinese business people coming here. But suddenly Iran has got all of these, has all these virus cases. Why not Russia? When he was asked, do you believe this virus was designed and programmed and was also transmitted directly from China to Iran and it's not a coincidence? He said, I believe this is not a coincidence, but rather a virus that goes selectively to countries that are considered enemies of the United States, namely China, Iran, and some EU countries, including Italy, as we've seen. So he's saying, connect the dots. This is suspect. Chinese businessmen, Chinese tourists go everywhere in the world. And yet really hard hit countries are China, Iran, and Italy. This is what they're